The 14th of October, 1943, Poland, the Sobibor extermination camp. Time had stopped. It was frozen at 1600 hours. At that moment, a silence, thick and viscous as blood, still reigned in hell. But this was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a bowstring pulled taut to its breaking point, the silence before an explosion that would either shatter the prison walls or bury the last glimmer of hope beneath its rubble. At the center of this silence, like the eye of a storm, stood a man. Lieutenant of the Red Army, Alexander Aronovich Pechersky. He stood by the carpentry workshop, his stillness deceptive. Inside him, a fire raged. Every cell in his body was focused, every nerve a live wire humming with high voltage. He wasn't looking at the wooden planks or the tools. His eyes, as cold and hard as gunmetal, were scanning the area. With his gaze, he drew invisible lines, connected points, and plotted routes. In his mind, at that very second, the most insane and desperate operation of his life was unfolding as if on a staff map. An operation where the stake wasn't victory but the right to die, a free death. Around him moved shadows that only yesterday could have been called men. Now they were cogs in a single, enormous, terrifying machine. Here, a jeweler from Amsterdam, whose delicate fingers were accustomed to gold, now gripped the handle of an axe. Here, a tailor from Warsaw, who had spent his life cutting silk and velvet, now waited for the signal to plunge a shiv into a guard's throat. Here, a boy, no older than 16, tasked with cutting the telephone wires, his face as white as a sheet. They were all watching Pechersky, not openly but furtively, and in their dead eyes, for this one single moment, a spark of insane hope had ignited. In 3 weeks, this Russian officer who had arrived on the last transport had done the impossible. He had transformed a herd of condemned broken people waiting for their turn in the gas chamber into a clandestine army. His weapons were not rifles. His weapons were words, discipline, and a rage as cold as ice. He had given them back the first thing that had been taken from them, their dignity. He made them remember they were not cattle, but men. And now, these men were waiting for the signal. The plan was calculated down to the second, insanely audacious and at the same time brilliant in its simplicity. Lure the SS officers one by one into the workshops under the pretext of a new uniform fitting or an inspection of finished work. And there, in the quiet, eliminate them silently, one after another. 15 men, 15 precise, swift blows, seize their weapons, then storm the armory and break out. A breakout through the gates, through the barbed wire, through the minefields, straight into immortality or into oblivion. Pechersky knew that most of them would not survive. He knew that his own chance of survival was close to zero. But that was the core of his terrible design. His plan was not life. His plan was vengeance. His plan was his own death. But the death of a soldier, not a victim. At 16:15, Unterscharführer Niemann approached the workshop gate. Pechersky caught the movement with his peripheral vision. His heart stopped for a beat, then hammered with double force like a heavy sledge on an anvil. The first one is in. The mechanism has been triggered. There is no turning back. He slowly, almost lazily, turned his head and met the gaze of 2 prisoners standing at the entrance to a barrack. Animal terror swam in their eyes. He gave a barely perceptible nod. Just one short, sharp nod. The signal. At that moment, time, which had been standing still, exploded and began to gallop, sweeping away everything in its path. But to understand how a single Soviet lieutenant, trapped in the very heart of the killing machine, could prepare and lead the only successful uprising in the history of Nazi death camps in just 3 weeks, we must go back. Back to a time before Sobibor. Back to the front line. The battle, the capture, and the long, torturous road to this hell. July 1941. The sky over Byelorussia was torn apart by the drone of Junkers and the scream of diving bombers. The earth trembled from exploding shells and the tracks of German tanks. In this cauldron of fire, where entire armies were turned to ash and dust, fought Lieutenant Alexander Pechersky. He was not a career military man. Before the war, he had been the head of amateur arts at a club in Rostov. But war quickly erases peacetime professions, leaving only one thing behind: the ability to survive and to kill. He was a good commander, calm, rational, able to inspire confidence in his soldiers even when all hope was lost. He had already known the bitterness of retreat, the taste of gunpowder, and the salty tang of blood on his lips. He had already learned to sleep in snatches, to eat on the move, and to distinguish by sound whether a mortar was friendly or hostile. In those days, he still wrote letters to his wife and daughter, letters full of tenderness and faith in a swift victory. He wrote about how he missed home, the smell of freshly baked bread, the silence. He did not yet know that true silence, the kind more terrifying than any cannonade, was waiting for him. In those days, his world was simple and clear, divided by the front line into black and white. Ahead, the enemy. Behind, the motherland. His task was to hold the line, follow orders, and if he was lucky, stay alive. He had no idea that fate was preparing an ordeal for him, one that would make the battles near Vyazma seem like child's play. An ordeal where the enemy would not be across a line of trenches, but everywhere. Where there would be no weapon, and the main battle would be the fight for the right to be considered human. In October of 41, during the Vyazma operation, his unit was encircled. For several days, hungry and exhausted, they tried to break through to their own lines. They fought for every meter of ground. Ammunition was running out. Fewer and fewer men were left. In one of the skirmishes, while pulling a wounded commander to safety, Pechersky was severely wounded by mine fragments. He lost consciousness. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. Thus began a different kind of hell for Lieutenant Pechersky, the hell of prisoner of war camps. First there was a camp in Smolensk, then in Borisov. Hunger, cold, typhus, the abuse of the guards. Death became mundane. People died by the dozens, by the hundreds, every day. They died from wounds, from disease, from starvation. They were shot for the slightest infraction or for no reason at all, for sport. Pechersky survived. He possessed that core of steel that wouldn't let him break. He quickly understood that in these conditions, survival was not for the physically strongest, but for those who did not surrender in spirit. He held on. Together with a few comrades, they tried to organize an escape, but their plan was discovered. They were brutally beaten, but not executed. Fate was saving him for something more terrible and more magnificent. In the spring of 1942, he was transferred to an SS labor camp on Shirokaya Street in Minsk. There, during a routine medical examination, his Jewish heritage was discovered. It was a death sentence. To the Nazis, a Soviet Jewish officer was not just an enemy. He was the embodiment of absolute evil, to be destroyed immediately. He and several dozen others like him were thrown into a cellar they called the Jewish Pit. For 10 days they sat in complete darkness, without food or water. They were waiting to be shot. Every rustle outside the door sounded like the footsteps of an executioner. But the execution never came. Instead, they were loaded into cattle cars, the doors were nailed shut, and they were sent into the unknown. They didn't yet know the name of their final destination. They didn't know they were traveling to a place not marked on any map of the world, to a place where the earth was soaked in blood and ash, and the air was filled with the screams of despair. On the 18th of September 1943, their transport arrived in Poland. It stopped at a small, neat station with a sign that read Sobibor. The lettering was done in a Tyrolean style with flower pots on the platform. Everything looked idyllic, almost pastoral. That evening, when the car door slid open with a deafening roar, Pechersky did not yet know that the sound he heard was not just the sound of a train car door. It was the sound of the gates of hell creaking open, gates from which no one had ever returned. When the heavy wagon doors screeched and groaned open, blinding sunlight stabbed into the stuffy, stale darkness. The people, tormented by several days of travel into the complete unknown without food or water, squinted, instinctively shielding their eyes with their hands. The air that rushed in was fresh, with the faint scent of pine and distant smoke. But this air brought no relief. It was saturated with something else, something intangible yet horrifying. A cloying, nauseating stench that Pechersky couldn't immediately identify. A stench that seemed to seep under the skin and settle in the lungs. The stench of decay. The stench of death. Schnell! Raus! Rough, barking shouts in German and the thud of rifle butts against the wagon walls jolted the people from their stupor. They were pushed out onto the platform. Alexander Pechersky was one of the first to jump down. His trained officer's eye instantly assessed the situation. A small, well-kept station surrounded by a pine forest. A few neat little houses drowning in flowers. Silence. And it was the most terrifying silence of his life. There was no barking of dogs, no shouts, no gunshots. Nothing to indicate a camp. Only this ringing, unnatural silence and that sweet smell. On the platform, they were met by several SS officers in perfectly pressed uniforms. They were smiling. They behaved with the utmost courtesy, almost hospitably. One of them, a tall man with aristocratic features, addressed the arrivals through a translator. He said they had arrived at a transit labor camp, that they would undergo sanitary processing, receive new clothes, and then be assigned to work details. He spoke calmly, convincingly, almost paternally. Some of the prisoners, especially those from European countries, believed him. Hope flickered in their eyes. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe they really would be given work. But Pechersky didn't believe a single word. His military experience, his intuition, screamed at him that this was all a monstrous, repulsive performance. He saw that the politeness of the SS men was as fake as a shark's smile. He saw that the neat little houses were just a set. He saw that something terrible was hiding behind the pine trees. He looked around, trying to find some sign, some clue. And he found one. At first glance, it was nothing special. Children were playing near one of the barracks. They were laughing and running, but something about the scene was wrong. Pechersky looked closer. The children were unusually well dressed, and they were alone. No adults, as if they had been put on display, like in a shop window. And then the selection began. The people were divided. Women, children, and the elderly were sent in one direction. Men in another. Pechersky found himself in a group of about 80 Soviet prisoners of war. They were led deeper into the camp, into the so-called Camp 1. The others, several thousand people, were led down another path. A path the prisoners called the Road to Heaven. They walked, unaware that they had only a few minutes left to live. They walked to a barrack where they were ordered to undress, hand over all their valuables, and proceed to the showers. Alexander Pechersky and his comrades heard a powerful engine start up in the distance. They didn't know it was the engine of a captured Soviet tank whose exhaust fumes were being piped into sealed rooms disguised as bathhouses. 20 minutes later, it was all over. The engine fell silent. And once again, there was silence. And in the air, the horrid sweet smell grew even stronger. In that moment, Pechersky understood everything. This was not a labor camp. This was not a transit point. This was a factory. A factory of death. An assembly line that turned people into smoke and ash. He looked at his comrades. In their eyes was the same silent question and the same soul-chilling horror. They had been left alive. But why? The answer came quickly. They, as skilled workers, carpenters, joiners, masons, had been spared to service this hell, to build new barracks, repair fences, sort the belongings of the murdered, to keep the assembly line running, the one that could grind them up at any moment. He surveyed the camp with new eyes, the eyes of an officer studying an enemy installation. A high fence of barbed wire, 3 rows deep, watchtowers with machine guns, minefields around the perimeter, a few dozen SS men and several hundred collaborationist guards, former Soviet POWs. It seemed impossible to escape. It was a perfect trap. A deadly mousetrap with no way out. Most men in his place would have broken, would have fallen into despair. But Alexander Pechersky was a soldier, and he understood one thing. If they wanted to survive, they could not hide or hope for a miracle. They had to fight. In that moment, standing in the middle of the roll call square of the Sobibor death camp, he realized, if he was destined to die here, he would not be just another victim to these executioners. He would become their personal nightmare, their jailer, and their god. The first days in Sobibor were like a descent into madness. Every day was permeated with fear and despair. The new world Pechersky had entered operated by its own horrific laws, where a human life was worth absolutely nothing. The air was heavy, saturated not only with the smell of burnt flesh, but also with a sense of total hopelessness. It hung in the air, settled on the barrack walls, and stared out from the empty eyes of the other prisoners. They moved slowly, as if in a dream, their movements mechanical. They had long since stopped hoping. They simply existed, waiting for the next whim of a god or a new batch of the condemned to put an end to their suffering. Pechersky and the surviving Soviet POWs were assigned to a work detail. Their task was to build new barracks in the so-called North Camp. The work was grueling. From dawn till dusk, under the shouts and blows of the overseers, they were fed a slop of rotten vegetables and a small piece of ersatz bread. Hunger was a constant, dull, aching sensation that crowded out all other thoughts. But for Pechersky, this work became a salvation. It kept him from sinking into the abyss of despair. It gave him an opportunity to study the camp. Every day, while carrying logs and hammering nails, like a scout in enemy territory, he memorized everything down to the smallest detail. He studied the layout of the barracks, the guard posts, the changing of the sentries. He watched the SS men. There weren't many of them, only about 30. They were the masters of this hell. They acted with absolute confidence in their impunity. They drank schnapps, listened to music, played with their dogs, and killed people in their spare time. Pechersky noticed their weakness. They were predictable. They lived by a strict routine. Their actions were subordinate to habit. They were arrogant and expected no resistance from the subhumans they already considered dead. He watched the collaborationist guards. There were many more of them, several hundred. They were former prisoners of war, mostly Ukrainians, who had agreed to serve the Nazis to save their own lives. They were more brutal than the Germans, as if trying to prove their loyalty to their new masters. But they too had a weakness. They were cowardly and undisciplined. Without orders from the SS, they became an unruly mob. But the most important thing was not this. The most important thing was to watch the prisoners. Pechersky was looking for men, looking for those in whose eyes the last spark of life had not yet been extinguished, those who had not yet broken. He quickly realized that his group of Soviet POWs was the only real force in this camp. They were soldiers. They knew how to handle weapons. They knew what discipline was. They were a cohesive group, ready to stand up for one another. But there were too few of them to do anything. They needed allies. They needed people from among the old prisoners who knew the camp from the inside. One evening, after work, a short, thin man in glasses approached Pechersky. His name was Leon Feldhendler. He was the son of a rabbi from the Polish town of Zhukiev. Before the war, he had worked at a flour mill. He had been in Sobibor for almost a year and was one of the leaders of a small underground group. They had long been harboring plans for an escape, but they lacked military experience and decisiveness. The arrival of the group of Soviet officers was a sign for them. Feldhendler spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. He told Pechersky about the camp's structure, that there was a Camp 3, the extermination zone with gas chambers and crematoria, which no work prisoners were allowed to access. He spoke of the sadism of the camp commandant, Franz Reichleitner, and his deputy Gustav Wagner, whom the prisoners had nicknamed the Beast. Pechersky listened intently without interrupting. He looked into Feldhendler's eyes and saw not only fear but also an unbending will. He realized he had found the man he was looking for, someone who could become his chief of staff. That evening, in the dim light of a stinking barrack, an alliance was born. An alliance between a Soviet officer and the son of a Polish rabbi. An alliance destined to challenge death itself. But first, they had to make the others believe. Make them believe in what seemed like absolute madness. However, an event soon occurred that solidified Pechersky's authority and showed everyone that this Russian officer was not going to submit. One of the overseers, a sadist nicknamed Capo, began to beat one of the prisoners, a weak and emaciated old man. He was kicking him, enjoying it. No one dared to intervene. Everyone stood with their eyes cast down. And then Pechersky took a step forward. "Don't touch him," he said calmly in broken German. The capo was stunned by such audacity. He turned to Pechersky, his face contorted with rage. But Pechersky looked straight at him without flinching. There was something in his eyes that made the overseer back down. Something cold, hard, and lethal. In that moment, everyone understood. A leader had appeared in the camp. But even he did not yet know that the most terrible test was still ahead. When patience was running out and it seemed despair was about to consume them all, Pechersky uttered words that were both salvation and insanity. "We must start an uprising." Pechersky's words hung in the heavy air of the barrack. An uprising. The word seemed not just insane to many, but blasphemous. An uprising. Here. In Sobibor. With bare hands against machine guns. It was tantamount to suicide. But Pechersky was no dreamer. He was the military engineer of his own small, desperate war. His main and unexpected weapon was his own mind. The mind of an officer, accustomed to analyzing, planning, and acting. He was not calling for a blind riot. He proposed a plan he had been nurturing all these days while carrying logs and staring into the faces of his executioners. He gathered a small circle of people he could trust in the furthest corner of the barrack. They were his fellow POWs, the Soviet soldiers, and a few people from Leon Feldhendler's underground group. By the light of a dim splinter, which they lit for only a few minutes, risking brutal punishment, he laid out his idea. He spoke quietly, but firmly. Every word was weighed and honed. He didn't promise them salvation. He promised them a chance. "We cannot escape one by one or in small groups," he began. "They will shoot us in the minefields or catch us in the forest. If we want a chance, we must act all together. We must decapitate the camp, eliminate the entire SS leadership, seize their weapons, and only then break out." The first reaction was silence. Disbelieving, almost hostile. Eliminate the SS men, the ones who seemed to be all-powerful gods of death, the ones whose mere glance made the blood run cold. "It's impossible," someone whispered. "They're armed. They're always on guard." "No," Pechersky replied firmly. "They are not on guard. They are arrogant. They are used to us being cattle. They don't expect a blow. That is our strength. We will act not with force, but with cunning. We will lure them one by one into the workshops. The jewelers, the tailors, the shoemakers, under the pretext of trying on a new suit, inspecting a commissioned ring or boots. They love beautiful things. They are greedy. They will come. And they will come alone, without guards. And there, men will be waiting for them." He scanned the faces of those present. There was not a shadow of a doubt in his eyes. He spoke as if he were reading an already approved combat order. In each workshop, a group of 2 or 3 men will be waiting, armed with whatever is at hand, axes, chisels, hammers. The blow must be a single one, precise and silent, no screams, no panic. We must take them all out within 1 hour. The idea was so audacious it bordered on madness, but in this madness, there was its own icy, merciless logic. This was the first victory. The victory of an idea over despair. People who had already resigned themselves to their fate suddenly saw a ghostly yet real possibility. Pechersky's plan was their unexpected weapon, forged from the ashes of their burned hopes. Leon Feldhendler immediately supported Pechersky. He, more than anyone, understood the psychology of the prisoners and knew all the intricacies of the camp's inner life. He became an indispensable assistant in working out the details. He knew which SS officer usually came to the workshops at what time, who among them was greedier, who was more cautious. He became the quiet ally, whose knowledge was no less important than Pechersky's military experience. Together they began to select the men. This was the most difficult and agonizing choice. They needed not just strong men, but cold-blooded men. Those who could strike without flinching. Those who could kill a man up close, looking him in the eye. Every evening, the underground committee gathered in the barrack. Pechersky drew a map of the camp on the floor with a stick, marking key points. The workshops, the armory, the guards' barracks, the gates, the watchtowers. He assigned roles. Who would be in the strike teams? Who would cut the communication lines? Who would disable the commandant's car? Who would lead the columns of people to the gates? Everyone knew their maneuver. Everyone knew their task. But even this first victory, the victory of hope, did not go unnoticed by the hostile environment. Among the prisoners, there were those who considered the plan suicidal, and those who feared that if it failed, the SS would unleash such a bloodbath that the gas chambers would seem like paradise. Rumors of a planned uprising began to spread through the camp, and that was lethally dangerous. One leak, one betrayal, and it would all be over. Inspired by Pechersky's audacious plan, the conspirators began to create their underground empire from nothing. The death camp, designed as a place of total chaos and annihilation of self, was briefly transformed into the headquarters of a secret army. This was their system, built in the very heart of hell, their answer to the German Ordnung. Pechersky, like a true commander, understood that the success of the operation depended on discipline and a clear division of roles. He was finally established as the undisputed authority. His orders were not questioned. His word was law. This rigidity was not a manifestation of a lust for power, but a vital necessity. Any weakness, any doubt, could lead to catastrophe. He divided all the conspirators into combat groups, fives. Each included 1 or 2 Soviet POWs with combat experience and several civilian prisoners who knew the camp well. This created a perfect symbiosis of strength and knowledge. Each group knew only its own task and had no information about the others. It was a classic clandestine cell structure that, in the event of one group's failure, would prevent the entire network from being exposed. The underground committee, led by Pechersky and Feldhendler, operated like a real command staff. They developed a complex system of signals, a code phrase, a specific gesture, a cap placed on the ground in a particular way. Everything had its meaning. Information was passed down the chain in whispers, from mouth to mouth, during work or on the way to the barracks. This system gave the people not only instructions, but something more, a sense of belonging to a common cause, a reason to exist. They ceased to be mere numbers, condemned to death. They became soldiers, fighters, men once more. The quiet, painstaking preparation began. In the carpentry workshop, under the supervision of Boris Cybulski and Shuka Leitman, prisoners began to secretly make and sharpen knives from stolen metal plates. In the forge, they prepared axes, honing them to razor sharpness. This was their production line, their small war factory, operating right under the enemy's nose. Every evening returning to the barrack, They hid these improvised weapons under their bunks in secret caches. Every sharpened knife, every honed axe was a small victory. It instilled confidence. It transformed despair into a cold, concentrated fury. Pechersky personally briefed each strike team. He didn't just give orders. He trained them. He showed them how to strike for maximum effect and silence. He explained how crucial it was to act with cold detachment without emotion. "You must not hate them in that moment," he would say. "Hate clouds the mind. You must be like surgeons. A cool head, a steady hand. You are performing a job, a hard, dirty, but necessary job." He understood that for many of these men who had never held a weapon in their lives, killing a person, even a monster like an SS officer, would be unbearably difficult. He conducted psychological training with them, convincing them that this was not murder, but an execution, a just retribution. A special role was assigned to the women. Several brave girls who worked in the laundry and the sewing workshop were to use a predetermined pretext to summon specific SS officers to the right place at the right time. This was one of the most dangerous tasks. Any clumsy word, any frightened glance could arouse suspicion and derail the entire operation. The date for the uprising was set for the 14th of October. This day was not chosen at random. Several key figures from the camp leadership, including the most brutal of them all, Gustav Wagner, were scheduled to be on leave. The camp would be left under the command of less experienced and more careless officers. It was the perfect moment. The closer the appointed date came, the more the tension grew. The men were living on the edge. They were afraid. Afraid of failure. Afraid of torture. Afraid of a painful death. But the fear of death was no longer as strong as the desire to avenge and to die free. Their life in the camp had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm of underground struggle. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of this new world. In the darkness of the barracks, a rebellion began to brew, not against the SS, but against Pechersky himself. Their growing organization and the iron discipline established by Pechersky could not fail to provoke resistance. In an environment where everyone was used to thinking only of their own survival, the idea of collective suicide, as many perceived the uprising, seemed alien and hostile. The voice of despair became one of the prisoners, a capo named Breslau. He was a man broken by camp life but who had managed to adapt. He had his little bit of power, his extra piece of bread, and he did not want to risk it. He was not a villain in the classic sense. He was the embodiment of the pragmatic egoism and fear that lurked in every soul. He began to sow doubt. At night, in the barrack, he would speak in whispers to other prisoners. "This Russian officer is leading us all to our deaths," he argued. "He doesn't know this camp. He doesn't understand who we're dealing with. Do you think we can kill SS men with axes? They'll shoot us all like dogs. And those who survive, they'll torture to death. Because of his crazy idea, everyone will die. It's better to keep quiet. Maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe the war will end soon, and we'll be liberated." His words found an audience. Many were afraid. They preferred the illusion of hope for salvation to the terrible certainty of death in battle. A schism was brewing in the camp. This was the greatest threat to Pechersky's plan. The enemy within was more dangerous than any SS officer because he struck at the weakest point, at hope and fear. Pechersky learned of Breslau's actions. He knew that if he didn't nip it in the bud, panic would spread like a plague, and everything would collapse. He had to act, and act harshly. One evening, he approached Breslau as he was once again trying to agitate a group of prisoners. Pechersky didn't shout. He spoke quietly, but his voice cut like a knife. "I know what you're doing," he said, looking Breslau straight in the eye. "You're spreading panic. You're trying to save your own skin at the cost of everyone else's lives." Breslau tried to object, but Pechersky didn't let him say a word. "There is no way back for us," he continued. "They will kill us all, sooner or later. The only question is how we die, like cattle in a slaughterhouse, or like soldiers with weapons in our hands. I am giving you a chance to die as men, and you are trying to take that chance away." He turned to the other prisoners who were watching the scene in horror. "Whoever follows him is a traitor, and in an army, traitors are shot. We are an army here, and our laws are the laws of war." Think about it. This was that very surgical cruelty. He did not threaten Breslau with physical violence. He struck a blow to his authority, exposing him as a coward and a traitor in the eyes of the others. He presented everyone with a stark choice, either with me or against me. There was no third option. The conflict was resolved. Breslau was morally broken and no longer posed a threat. Pechersky had defended his law. The mutiny was suppressed. Unity was restored. But while they were dealing with their internal struggles, they failed to notice that their real enemy, the camp administration, was preparing its own final crushing blow. A few days before the scheduled date of the uprising, terrible news arrived in the camp. The SS announced that a selection would soon be made, and a portion of the work prisoners would be sent to another camp. Everyone understood what that meant. There was no other camp. It was a euphemism for the gas chamber. There was no more time. The news of the impending selection struck like a bolt from the blue. This was the moment, the cracked armor that finally destroyed all illusions. It became clear that passive waiting was not a survival strategy, but merely a postponement of the inevitable. The time for planning was over. The time for action had come. The 14th of October. The day began as usual. Morning roll call, a meager breakfast, deployment to work details. But the air was electrified. It vibrated with a silent tension. People tried not to look each other in the eye, afraid of giving themselves away. Everyone knew what they had to do. Everyone was replaying their own deadly scenario in their mind. Pechersky was outwardly calm, but inside, everything was on fire. He understood that he was responsible for the lives of 600 people. Any mistake, any unforeseen event, could lead to failure. The operation was set to begin at exactly 1600 hours. The first phase, the silent elimination of the SS men in the workshops. At 15:30, Pechersky gave his final orders. He approached Shuka Leitman, who was leading the strike team in the carpentry workshop. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Leitman, a strong, silent man, just nodded. His hand gripped the axe handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. At 1600 hours, Unterscharführer Josef Wolf approached the tailor's workshop. He had been lured there on the pretext of a fitting for a new uniform. He walked inside, smiling smugly. The door closed quietly behind him. A few seconds later, a tailor came out of the barrack and, as if by chance, adjusted his cap. It was the signal. The first one was down. The mechanism of death, set in motion by the Nazis, had backfired for the first time, striking its own creators. Almost simultaneously, Oberscharführer Siegfried Greiches entered the shoemaker's shop to pick up his new, shiny boots. He was met there with an axe. In each workshop, its own bloody drama was unfolding. Unterscharführer Niemann, who had come for a custom leather briefcase, was killed at the other end of the camp. The SS officers were disappearing one by one, silently, without a single shot. The camp continued its normal life, unaware that its leadership was being methodically annihilated. Pechersky was at the center of the events, coordinating the actions. He received reports and gave new orders. Everything was going according to plan. It seemed victory was near. But then, the unforeseen happened. One of the SS men, Karl Frenzel, unexpectedly changed his route and went not to a workshop, but to the barrack where the clothes of the murdered were sorted. He noticed something suspicious. At the same time, another SS man, Erich Bauer, arrived in a truck to pick up prisoners. He saw the body of his comrade, which they hadn't had time to hide, and opened fire indiscriminately with his pistol. The covert phase of the operation was over. Chaos erupted. "Hurrah! Forward!" Pechersky yelled. This cry became the signal for a general uprising. From all sides, prisoners began to pour out of the barracks and workshops. Those with weapons fell upon the stunned guards. The rest, armed with stones, sticks, and their own fury, rushed towards the gates. The camp, which a minute ago had been a model of order, turned into a boiling cauldron. Screams, gunshots, groans. The guards in the watchtowers opened up a hail of machine gun fire. People fell, but the others kept running. They ran straight into the machine guns, their bodies shielding those who ran behind them. Pechersky led the main group towards the central gates. He knew that breaking through them was the only chance. The assault on the armory had failed. There were too few weapons. There was only one thing left: to fight their way out. They reached the gates. A short but fierce battle ensued. Several guards were killed. They managed to open the gates, and the crowd surged to freedom. But freedom was deceptive. Ahead of them lay a minefield. The first rows of runners were blown up on the mines. Their mangled bodies cleared a path for the others. It was a terrible price, the price of victory. Pechersky ran with everyone else. He did not hide. He led the people forward. Bullets whistled around him. He could feel the wind from them stirring his hair. Next to him, one of his closest comrades fell, struck by a bullet. But Pechersky did not stop. He ran. He ran towards the forest that loomed ahead. The forest was salvation. The forest was life. The battle ended in victory, but its cost was immense. They had broken out of hell, but now found themselves on the brink of total exhaustion, in a forest full of enemies. And it was in that moment, in the ensuing silence broken only by the groans of the wounded, that Pechersky heard a cry. But it was not a cry of terror. It was a cry of amazement and hope. Of the nearly 600 prisoners in the camp on the day of the uprising, about 300 managed to break through. The rest were killed during the escape or were hunted down and murdered afterwards. But even for those who found themselves beyond the barbed wire, the struggle for life had just begun. The forest, which had seemed like their salvation, was full of dangers. The Nazis organized a massive manhunt. Not only SS and police units, but also army detachments participated in the search for the fugitives. The escaped prisoners, exhausted, hungry, many of them wounded, split into small groups. They tried to hide in the swamps and thickets. Pechersky managed to gather a group of several dozen people around him, mostly Soviet POWs. He understood they couldn't stay put. They had to move as far east as possible, towards Byelorussia, where large partisan units were rumored to be operating. It was a long and arduous journey. They walked by night, hiding during the day. They ate roots and berries. They suffered from cold and disease. But they were free. This feeling was intoxicating and gave them the strength to go on. After several days of wandering, they got lucky. They stumbled upon a partisan detachment. It was salvation. The euphoria quickly gave way to a collision with a new reality. The partisans, though they were their own people, met them with distrust. Who were they? Former prisoners? Escaped from a German camp? Or perhaps provocateurs? They were interrogated for a long time, vetted. Pechersky's story of the uprising in Sobibor sounded so incredible that it was hard to believe. But in the end, they were accepted. Pechersky became a soldier again. He and his comrades joined the Shchor's partisan detachment, and later, as part of the Voroshilov detachment, continued to fight the enemy. Alexander Pechersky proved himself to be a talented saboteur. He participated in demolitions on the railway, derailing German military trains. He was in his element again. He was fighting. The war ended. Victory. It seemed all the trials were over. But for Pechersky, a new, most difficult and unjust chapter of his life was beginning. The irony of civilization proved to be more terrifying than a Nazi camp. When he returned to the Soviet Union, he, like many other former prisoners of war, was met not with honors, but with suspicion. He went through an NKVD filtration camp. He was interrogated. How was he captured? Why did he survive? Was he a German spy? His story about Sobibor, about the uprising he organized and led, was met only with disbelief. In the eyes of the investigators, his feat looked too fantastic and therefore suspicious. The system he fought for could not believe that a Soviet officer, taken prisoner, could not only survive but also organize such a daring operation. In the official historiography of the time, there was no place for heroes who had been in captivity. There were only victors or traitors. He wasn't shot or imprisoned, but his feat was erased, forgotten, buried in the archives under a top-secret stamp. Instead of the star of the hero, which he undoubtedly deserved, oblivion awaited him. His brotherhood, forged in the hell of Sobibor, was destroyed. Their heroism was buried alive. After the war, Alexander Pechersky returned to his native Rostov-on-Don. He tried to live a normal, peaceful life. He started working in a theater again, but the war in Sobibor would not let him go. They came to him at night in his nightmares. He saw the faces of his fallen comrades, heard the screams and the gunshots. He forever remained a soldier of that forgotten war of his. He could not remain silent. He wanted the world to know the truth about Sobibor. He wrote his memoirs about the uprising. He tried to publish them, but without success. In the Soviet Union, the topic of the Holocaust and the participation of Jews in the war was under an unspoken ban. His story was an inconvenient truth that the system preferred to ignore. In 1948, during the campaign against rootless cosmopolitans, he was fired from his job. He couldn't find a new one for a long time. He, the hero of Sobibor, the man who organized the most successful uprising in a death camp, was forced to scrape by with odd jobs to feed his family. He lived in poverty and obscurity. The fates of the other surviving participants of the uprising varied. Many of those who managed to make their way to the West told the world what had happened in Sobibor. Their testimonies formed the basis of books and films. Alexander Pechersky's name became known outside the USSR. He became a national hero in Israel. He was invited to meetings, and letters poured in from all over the world. But the Soviet authorities would not let him leave the country. He was locked in a new prison, a prison of oblivion in his own homeland. Leon Feldhandler, his loyal comrade and chief of staff, managed to survive the war, but died tragically in 1945 in Lublin after the liberation. He was murdered by anti-Semites. Other participants of the uprising who remained in the USSR shared Pechersky's fate. Their feat was also not recognized. They lived quiet, unnoticed lives, carrying the heavy burden of their memories. The years went by. Pechersky grew old. He continued to fight for memory. He corresponded with other survivors, collected materials, and tried to achieve justice. But the wall of silence was insurmountable. Only in the 60s, during the thaw, did Soviet press begin to write about him tentatively. But even then, his feat was presented in a distorted light, downplaying his role in concealing the nationality of many of the uprising's participants. Recognition came too late. Alexander Aronovich Pechersky died in 1990 at the age of 80. He died in his bed in a small apartment in Rostov-on-Don. The greatest hero of Sobibor, the man who challenged the machinery of genocide and won, passed away in obscurity. He was buried in an old cemetery. There were no lavish wreaths or grand speeches at his modest grave, but as local residents told it, small stones, brought from far away, would sometimes appear on it. No one knew who brought them. Official history tried to bury the feat of Alexander Pechersky and his comrades in archival dust, but their story refused to die. It became a legend passed on in whispers. It lived in the stories of survivors, scattered all over the world. It was told in different languages, but it spoke of the same thing: the incredible courage of people who, at the very bottom of hell, managed to rise up and strike a blow against their executioners. It was said that for many years after the war, in the forests around Sobibor, one could find traces of that terrible day: rusted shell casings, remnants of barbed wire. Local residents avoided the place. They believed that the land there still moaned with pain and rage. There was a belief among former frontline soldiers that the spirit of Lieutenant Pechersky had not found peace, that he still wanders those forest paths, guarding the memory of his fallen fighters. The story of the Sobibor uprising became a myth of David and Goliath, of how a small group of desperate people, armed with axes and their own will, was able to crush a perfectly tuned machine of death. The Sobibor camp was destroyed by the Nazis immediately after the uprising. They tried to wipe all traces of their shame from the face of the earth. They razed the ground, planted trees in its place, so that no one would ever know what happened there. But they could not destroy the memory. So what was left in the end? A bitter irony of fate. The man who organized a victory in the very heart of hell was defeated by the system he fought for. He won his war, but lost the peace. Was his struggle worth such sacrifices? The answer to that question was given by Pechersky himself in his memoirs. He wrote that the main goal of the uprising was not survival. The main goal was to prove that even in inhuman conditions, one could remain human. That one can and must fight even when there is no hope. That a death in battle is better than a life on one's knees. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that the most powerful weapon of man is not steel or gunpowder, but his spirit. A spirit that cannot be broken, burned in a crematorium, or buried in a mass grave. Like a phoenix, it always rises from the ashes to tell the world its incredible story. The story of how one Soviet officer turned a death camp into a battlefield and proved that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a place for light.